Another one, powdered cocaine and crack. Now, part of the motivation, correct me if I'm wrong, Glenn, because you were there in a sense that I wasn't, but powdered cocaine was sentenced. I just mean that I was grown.
Yeah, I know what you meant.
You were grown-er. So
I'm older than you are.
you were studying it. But like powdered cocaine and crack. They came down harder on crack, partly because crack was sold in outdoor markets, and selling of crack created the kind of violence that can help tear up a neighborhood, whereas powdered cocaine was mainly dealt on playgrounds and in basements and partaken of there. And so there was a sense that crack is more dangerous to the urbanity than Ethan, doing some lines in the bathroom in his parents' house. So there was that. And then there was also that black leaders were behind those laws when they were initially instituted. Now today, that's called just naked, structural racism. It was racist that crack was cracked down on more than powdered cocaine. I have watched white guys do high fives talking about that. But was it really that simple? There was the idea that crack was more dangerous, and a lot of black people thought so, which means that the idea that it was systemic racism is much weaker than we're often told. Am I onto something there, or am I missing that?
Oh, well, it's a long time ago, it feels like now. But yeah, the crack powder disparity, 100 to 1. The minimum weight needed to trigger the mandatory minimum sentence of the crack cocaine was 1/100th of the minimum weight for the powder cocaine, and the mandatory minimum sentences did get applied in federal cases, and that was a disparity. It's true that many African American representatives in the Congress supported the legislation on that because their communities were catching hell. Who's the guy? Silent Black Majority, the writer, political scientist,
Michael Fortner.
Yeah, Michael Fortner,
who was there, black writer.
It explores this in the case of heroin in New York City and the Rockefeller drug laws in the 70s and 80s. And James Foreman at Yale, the law professor there, explores the same theme in the case of Washington, D.C., crack cocaine and the depredations of the drug disorder. And sure, there was push in the black community for law enforcement because people were being affected adversely by the violence that accompanied the trade. But is that structural racism? I mean, of course, that invites the whole mass incarceration thing. And, I've written about this in a register, very sympathetic to structural racism arguments, saying in part because the people who were caught up in this were disproportionately black, the larger society didn't pull back from the brink. Even if the intent were not explicitly anti-black, the social experiment of expanding the number in prison from 500,000 to 2 million in a quarter century, which is a remarkable institutional upheaval. We completely changed the way in which we deal with social disorder and social dysfunction, ratcheting very substantially up the degree of punitiveness, which could be measured along a lot of different dimensions, including the very scale of people who are incarcerated. Of course, a rise in crime had something to do with that, and the more subtle historical analyses credit the fact that crime rates induced in the popular sentiment of a much greater tolerance for punitive legislation. But, we overshot. I mean, I think it's a fair reading of history that we overshot. I think a lot of conservatives and people agree that we overshot, and in the aughts, we pulled back, and those numbers peaked out, and they leveled. Now, crime did come down as well, but I think the sentiment against incarceration at the scale that it had reached by the late 1990s is pretty widespread in the society, so we pulled back. But here's the structural racist argument that I think has to be taken seriously, which is if the racial issue hadn't been so central in crime and punishment and in the representation of blacks within those who were really, really on the front end of the punitive regime, would we have had we collectively, the polity and the culture of the United States of America, the political culture, have had a different reaction, been less tolerant of the excesses if they had been falling upon people about whom we had a greater degree of concern? I don't think that's an implausible thing to say.
No.
Racial stigma that, you take the history back, roll it back, not just to the aughts or to the 90s or to the 80s, roll it back to the 50s and to the 40s, roll it back into the 20s and to the teens. And the insinuation of racial stereotyping, of racial derogation, of racial contempt, it's hard to escape that in the lynching and the enforcement of Jim Crow in the South. It's hard to escape it in the teeming cities of the Northeast and the Midwest and mid-20th century where, the 60s, you see what happens with the riots and stuff. You get explosion after explosion. A lot of it around the law enforcement type issues. The Kerner Commission, et cetera. They were liberals, yes. They might have been a little bit starry-eyed, yeah, but they weren't crazy and they weren't all wrong about what they were describing in terms of the ghetto of America. It was only a quarter century after Gunnar Myrdal's The American Dilemma, which is An American Dilemma, which is a devastating indictment and chronicle of racial subordination in the 1930s and the 1940s. So, it's not like there's no there. I mean, you'd have to be blind to history to think that there was no there.
Yeah, no one knew what the outcome was going to be. And once the outcome happened, sensitivity to it was weaker because people deep down didn't care as much about black people.
Plausible hypothesis.
Yes, plausible hypothesis. But I want to get at this. This is what Simone is thinking. This is what's taught to people in college. In the early 90s, were there white people who, although not explicit, decided, let's target crack cocaine more because when black people create disorder, it's a worse thing than when white people do. Is that what was going on? Or was there another reason, such as open air violence, that crack cocaine was given the harder penalty?
No, I actually know something.
It was because of racism.
I'm sorry to have to report that I know way too much about crack cocaine, man. I mean, because I used to be a crack cocaine addict in the 1980s things where I could have gotten myself shot dead out there on the streets of Boston, Massachusetts. And I go back to Chicago sometimes and hang out with some of my old schoolmates and stuff like that. And, Chicago in the 1980s, not Chicago in the 2020s, because Chicago in the 2020s, you'd be going around the drug houses, you end up with a bullet in your head. But it was a lot of cash money, very easily storable, small transactions, frequent, drug houses, people sliding the drugs under the door and whatnot. A lot of people walking around with guns. And there was just a lot of violence. The bodies piled up. You look at the murder rates in these cities in the late 80s and early 90s, it makes today look like a walk in the park. I mean, we're still lower than the peak of the violent crime rates that were reached in their 1990s.
This is why crack cocaine was penalized more, wasn't it?
Yeah, because of the violence, because of the stories that were in the newspaper, because of the, how many drug deals gone bad and, multiple homicides with kids in the back room can you have in the newspaper before somebody says enough?
In other words, it wasn't white people thinking when black people make noise, it gets on our nerves and so we're going to penalize more, because that's what Simone is taught.
Well, there probably was some of that. I mean, the crack baby hysteria, right? The whole cohort of black babies was going to be deficient because there were so many mothers on crack, and there was kind of hysteria about that. I'm sure you can find hyperbole and exaggeration in popular culture and certain stereotyping images that get projected and whatnot and so on. But a lot of the response was coming from black people in those communities themselves.
And it's an interesting contrast between us, because you're mentioning with candor, your experience with crack cocaine. It might surprise you and some of our listeners that I am hardly unfamiliar with powdered cocaine and well into my 50s.
I'm
I love this stuff,
shocked.
And more to the point, I cannot remember a time that I partook of it that was not either underground, in the back of something, way upstairs. It's in the bathroom. It's something that you do somewhere concealed. You do not do it out on the corner. You do it, as the French say, en cachette. You're hidden. That's powdered cocaine culture. And so that seems like it would have been seen as less destructive to the general polity back in 1991 than what you just talked about with the crack, where it's open air and guns and people falling down in the street. And so it's always seemed to me there's a difference in the way people handle crack versus the way people handle powder. And I've always known, partly because of my own personal experience, and many people have said it. And so that's something. And I think some people, their eyes roll, like we're getting into too much detail, we're missing something. But I would just say, what are we missing? And then you add Michael Fortner's point. And I should stress, Michael Fortner is black. He is somebody who was in these communities experiencing it at the time. There were black people behind this too. And what are you calling them to say that they didn't know their systemic racism when they saw it? They were terrified by what was going on with crack cocaine, not people snorting it, off of the back of their hand in their basement. That wasn't the problem. And that's the way you do powder as opposed to crack. This makes a certain sense, right?
Yeah, it makes a certain sense, although I don't think it begins to exhaust the structural systemic racism territory, right? I mean, they're not going to just be doing powder and crack cocaine. They're going to be doing everything. They're going to be doing what's on movies and in the television. They're going to be doing where the highways built. Take a look at the 1619 Project, Compendium, all those essays. I mean, a lot of them touch on areas that are affected by the history of race, but that are not, Oscar's so white. What about the telling of the history of the story?
With some of that,